The 19th of June, 1944. Philippine Sea. The sky was alive with the roar of engines. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance had set up a trap. The Hellcats of VF-6 and the TBF Avengers were already waiting positioned at the perfect altitude. The first Japanese plane was torn apart by a barrage of gunfire, a violent explosion that sent pieces of metal and fire raining down into the sea. The pilot's last moments were nothing but chaos, his face twisted in disbelief as the cockpit was consumed by a second Zero attempted to bank and avoid the incoming fire, but the Hellcat was too fast, too precise. In the wake of the carnage, silence took over the sea. The sounds of destruction were drowned out by an eerie stillness, a pause that stretched out in the wake of the destruction. The fire from the burning planes still flickered in the distance, but there was nothing else. No movement, no sounds of engines, no cries of distress from the Japanese pilots. The sky was empty. This wasn't just a victory for the Americans, it was the shattering of a myth. The once feared Japanese air superiority was crumbling before their eyes. For the first time, the Zero wasn't invincible. For the first time, Japan's Air Force had run out of pilots who could hold their ground. And the American pilots, unbothered and efficient, knew they were about to. In that moment, it wasn't just another battle in the Pacific, it was the breaking of Japan's last hope for air dominance. The 19th of June, 1944. The Philippine Sea was the setting for a battle that would change the course of the Pacific War. The U.S. Navy under Japan's forces were at their breaking point. The once proud Imperial Navy was a shadow of its former self, struggling to replenish losses, and its pilots, once feared across the skies, were now being replaced with green recruits. The Japanese Zero fighter, once considered unbeatable in the skies, was still a powerful tool, but it was no longer the deadly machine it had been in the early days of the war. Despite Japan's best efforts to maintain its air superiority, the cracks in their strategy were beginning to show. On the other side, the United States had the upper hand. By 1944, the US had mastered the art of war in the Pacific. Their fleets bolstered by military to crush the Japanese war machine, the US Navy, had not only the numbers, but the resolve to end the war sooner rather than later. As the battle raged, both sides knew what was at stake. For Japan, it was a matter of survival. Their air force, once the backbone of their military strategy, was crumbling. If they lost this battle, they would lose their. For the U.S., the stakes were equally high. The Japanese military was running out of resources, out of experienced pilots, and out of time. If they could break Japan's air power in this battle, they could shorten the war by months, saving countless American lives. But if they failed, the Japanese might still have enough fight left in them to. The battle in the Philippine Sea was more than just a tactical clash. It was a decisive moment in the war, one that would determine how much longer the fighting would continue. The American strategy was clear: destroy the Japanese Air Force, break their morale, and cripple their ability to defend their fleet. The Japanese, on the other hand, still clung to the belief that their elite pilots, their top-of-the-line aircraft, and their battle-hardened strategies would be enough to turn the tide. They had faced overwhelming odds before and had come out victorious. But the brutal truth was sinking in. They were running out of time, out of options, and out of skilled pilots who could take on the Americans. The battle that was about to unfold would be one of the most decisive in the Pacific theater. The Japanese were still clinging to the hope that they could turn the tide with their remaining forces, but the American fleet, with its superior air cover and battle-hardened pilots, was ready to deliver the final blow. This wasn't just a battle for air superiority, it was a battle for the future of the Pacific, and for Japan, it would be the final test of their ability to defend their empire. The balance was about to shift forever. If the Americans succeeded, the Pacific War would move closer to its end. The 19th of June, 1944. The Philippine Sea. A critical moment in the Pacific War, one that would reveal the tipping point for Japan's once dominant air power. The battle was a decisive confrontation between the superior American air forces and the increasingly fragile Japanese defenses. On one side, the United States had honed its air capabilities, while on the other, Japan's elite forces were rapidly depleting. The battle would expose the key factors that made the American forces overwhelmingly effective, while the limitations of Japan's once-feared Zero aircraft became brutally apparent. The F-6F Hellcat, a formidable fighter, was a cornerstone of the U.S. Navy's air superiority. Designed as a successor to the F-4F Wildcat, the Hellcat was a much-improved machine in terms of survivability, firepower, and maneuverability. It was equipped with 6 .50-caliber Browning machine guns, providing it with deadly offensive firepower. Its robust design allowed it to take hits and keep flying a significant. With its speed of 380 miles per hour and a range of over 1,000 miles, it was capable of sustaining. The TBF Avenger, America's premier torpedo bomber, played a pivotal role in the success of the U.S. Navy. While its primary role was to launch torpedoes against enemy ships, the Avenger's versatility allowed it to carry out a variety of bombing missions as well. Its ability to launch attack, though it had a relatively slow speed of about 275 miles per hour, the Avenger was heavily armored, and its durability allowed it to sustain significant damage and still return to base. In the Philippine Sea, Avengers launched devastating attacks on Japanese ships, scoring hits that decimated the already vulnerable fleet. The A-6M-0, once a symbol of Japanese dominance in the air, found itself facing an adversary it could no longer outclass. The Zero had been designed for agility and speed, making it the superior dogfighter at the beginning of the Pacific War. However, by mid-1944, its weaknesses were becoming evident. Despite its incredible maneuverability, the Zero was lightly armored. The Zero's engines were powerful, allowing it to achieve speeds of around 332 miles per hour. But this was no longer enough to evade the tactics of the Japanese pilots were built around their advantage in agility and the element of surprise. They would typically dive into combat at high speeds, attempting to outmaneuver their opponents by using tight turns and quick changes in altitude. However, the battle revealed the cracks in this strategy. As the Zero was pitted against the more powerful and better armored Hellcats, Japanese pilots found themselves outclassed not just in firepower. Their reliance on quick maneuvers was no longer enough to overcome the systematic and disciplined approach of American tactics. The battle wasn't just a matter of better planes, it was a matter of more experienced pilots, better coordination, and a systematic approach to combat that outmatched Japan's fading expertise. By the time the battle had ended, the loss of experienced Japanese pilots was felt deeply. The training and experience of this lack of trained pilots, combined with the overwhelming technological advantage of the American forces, sealed Japan's fate in the Philippine Sea. The battle on the 19th of June, 1944, wasn't just a turning point in the Pacific War, it was a clear demonstration that the balance of power had shifted. The United States had found a way to defeat Japan's once invincible air force by adapting to the changing nature of warfare. Japan's Zero, once feared across the skies, could no longer hold its ground against the relentless American onslaught. The Americans had cracked the Japanese code superior tech. The roar of the engines filled the cockpit, drowning out everything else. For the American pilots, it was just another mission. Their training had prepared them for this moment, and they were determined to execute their roles with precision. For the Japanese pilots, the situation was different. The thrill of combat was familiar, but as they dove toward the American fleet, something felt off. Their minds were clouded with uncertainty. The Hellcat pilots were calm and focused. Their orders were clear: identify the targets, engage and disengage quickly. He immediately began to climb, scanning for the next target. It was a routine, something they'd all done thousands of times in training. But this wasn't training. This was real, and their efficiency made it seem effortless. On the other side, the Zero pilots were experiencing a different reality. When they saw the Hellcats coming, they initially felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the rush that had carried them through countless battles. They adjusted their altitude, prepared to engage, certain that their superior agility would give them the edge. But as they closed in, the Americans didn't panic. The Hellcats didn't break formation. They didn't fly erratically or make mistakes. They were calm, efficient, and deadly. The first Zero pilot pulled hard on the stick, trying to evade the incoming fire, but he was too late. A burst of machine gun fire There was no time to process what had happened. The Zero spiraled downward, flames licking at the edges of the fuselage. The pilot's last thought was one of disbelief. He had fought in countless battles, but he'd never faced an opponent like this. The American pilots were unlike anything he had encountered before. They didn't make mistakes, they didn't panic, and they were everywhere. He thought back to his training, the lessons drilled into him by his superiors. Use your agility, outturn them, catch them by surprise. But this time the surprise was on him. In the cockpit of the second Hellcat, the pilot maintained his calm. He watched as the Zero went down, his mind already moving on to the next target. This was just another fight, another set of orders to carry out. He had done this countless times in training, and now he was doing it in the air. The adrenaline buzzed in his veins, but it wasn't fear, it was focus. He was already looking for the next target, his eyes scanning the sky for another enemy. No emotion, just a steady determination. On the other side, the Zero pilots were losing their edge. The second pilot, who had been confident moments ago, now found himself questioning his every move. The Americans were everywhere. No matter how hard he turned, how quickly he maneuvered, they seemed to be one step ahead. His aircraft was nimble, but the Hellcats were relentless. They didn't give him a chance to break away. He tried to climb, to dive, to turn, but the Hellcat was already on his tail, its guns spitting fire. A final shot from the American plane hit him, and everything went dark. The cockpit was silent. The world outside was nothing but smoke and fire. The second pilot's last thought was one of confusion. How had it all gone wrong? He had been trained to face these enemies, but they weren't like anything he had imagined. They were too disciplined, too well coordinated. There was no chaos, no scrambling. There was only the cold precision of American air superiority. Back in the American cockpit, the pilot remained calm. He had seen the Zero go down, but there was no sense of triumph. This was the job, and he had done it well. His training had prepared. As the battle raged on, the Japanese pilots began to feel the weight of their losses. Their planes were going down faster than they could keep up, and the Americans showed no signs of slowing down. The Hellcats, with their superior tactics, continued to dominate the skies, picking off 1-0 after another. The pilots who remained fought with desperation, but it was clear that they were outmatched. The Americans weren't just better equipped, they were better trained, more organized, and more disciplined. In the end, it was a battle of endurance. The American pilots, unwavering and professional, chipped away at the Japanese forces. The Japanese pilots, once full of confidence, were now battling not just the Americans but their own fear and uncertainty. They had believed in their superiority, but now they were faced with a reality they couldn't escape. The tide had turned, and the American pilots knew it. There was no cheering, no celebration, just the quiet confidence of a job well done, and the knowledge that the air battle over the Philippine Sea had been decisively won. The 19th of June, 1944, marked a crucial turning point in the Pacific War, as the United States demonstrated its overwhelming superiority over Japan in the skies. The battle over the Philippine Sea revealed not only the effectiveness of American aircraft and tactics, but also exposed the critical vulnerability. The key to the American success was not just their superior aircraft, but the ability to rapidly replace lost equipment and personnel, something Japan could no longer sustain. The United States had a distinct advantage when it came to industrial power. Unlike Japan, which had been fighting a war on multiple fronts with diminishing resources, the U.S. had built an industrial war machine that could outproduce its enemies. Factories across the United States pumped out new aircraft bombs and weapons at an unprecedented rate. The F-6F Hellcat and TBF Avenger, the two aircraft most responsible for the victory in the Philippine Sea, were produced in Hellcats alone had a production rate of over 7,800 units, ensuring that even after heavy losses the U.S. could replace its aircraft quickly. This constant replenishment allowed the Americans to keep up the pressure on the Japanese. Japan, on the other hand, found itself unable to replace its aircraft and pilots at the same rate. The Japanese A-6M0, once the symbol of Japanese air superiority, was no longer the unstoppable force it had been in the early days of the war. By mid-1944, the Zero's weaknesses were clear. Its lack of armor, limited firepower, and inability to sustain the demands of prolonged combat made it vulnerable to more advanced. Despite the legendary status of the Zero and its pilots, Japan's ability to produce these machines was rapidly declining. The factories that once churned out the iconic fighters were now unable to keep pace with the destruction of war. Worse, Japan's loss of experienced pilots, many of whom had perished in previous battles, left them relying on The American approach was systematically designed to counter the Japanese advantages. Hellcats had been specifically designed to be easier to fly and maintain than their predecessors, with superior guns and a stronger airframe to withstand damage. The tactics used by the American pilots were not based on the individual skill of a lone fighter, but on teamwork and strategic coordination. Hellcats were typically deployed in formations, flying in protective groups that enabled them to respond to any threat effectively. Navy's Avengers were equipped with torpedoes and bombs capable of taking down enemy ships from long distances, allowing the American forces to strike at the heart of Japan's naval strength, while keeping their aircraft out of harm's way. In contrast, Japan had failed to adapt its strategies to the changing nature of warfare. In a high-speed combat environment where split-second decisions were critical, these new pilots were ill-equipped to deal with the American onslaught. The Japanese still relied heavily on individual dogfighting tactics, which were increasingly ineffective against the American strategy of coordinated strikes and hit-and-run techniques. While the Zero could still outmaneuver many Allied planes in one-on-one combat, it was no match for the Hellcats when the Americans operated as a coordinated unit. As the battle unfolded, the strategic decisions made by the U.S. military proved decisive. By the time of the Philippine Sea, Admiral Raymond Spruance and his commanders had refined their tactics to ensure that no single mistake would lead to disaster. They understood the importance of air superiority, and they relentlessly pressured the Japanese from the moment the battle began. Their ability to adapt quickly to the changing circumstances, shifting from aggressive strikes to more defensive postures when necessary, made them nearly unbeatable. In contrast, Japan's strategic decisions had become increasingly out of touch with the realities of the war. Their reliance on the Zero and experienced pilots who were dwindling in numbers, combined with an industrial base that couldn't keep up with the demand for aircraft and pilots, sealed their fate. Japan's leadership, still clinging to the belief that they could reverse the tide of the war with bold, heroic gestures, had failed to address the structural issues that were rapidly leading to their collapse. The aftermath of the Philippine Sea was clear. Japan had lost its ability to challenge American dominance in the air. The battle exposed the fundamental weaknesses in Japan's war machine: lack of resources, insufficient industrial capacity, and a declining pool of trained pilots. The United States, on the other hand, had demonstrated the immense advantage provided by its industrial strength, logistical capabilities, and superior tactics, solidified its control of the skies in the Pacific, setting the stage for the eventual defeat of Japan. The battle marked a pivotal moment in the Pacific War, one in which Japan's last hopes of regaining air superiority were dashed. With the Americans able to replenish their aircraft and pilots while the Japanese could not, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. The United States had outproduced and outclassed Japan, and the momentum of the war had shifted irreversibly in their favor. The 19th of June, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The sky above the American fleet was no longer a place of uncertainty and fear for the U.S. pilots. It had become a domain where the myth of Japanese air superiority once. For years, the Zero had been heralded as the ultimate weapon in air combat. Its speed, agility, and ability to outmaneuver virtually any enemy aircraft made it the terror of Allied pilots. Japanese propaganda had built the Zero into a symbol of Japan's invincibility in the sky. Every victory, every successful raid further cemented its reputation. The Zero was a mythic weapon, a symbol of Japanese technological prowess and the skill of their pilots. But in reality, the Zero was not invincible. It was simply the best of what Japan could offer in the early stages of the war. However, by the time the 19th of June, 1944 rolled around, the Zero's myth had been systematically dismantled. The technological gap between Japan and the United States had grown too wide. The F-6F Hellcat, which replaced the aging F-4F Wildcat, was everything the Zero was not. Heavier, faster, and better armed, the Hellcat was designed specifically to combat the Japanese fighters. Its 6.50 caliber machine. But it wasn't just the Hellcat's firepower that made it a superior aircraft. It was the Hellcat's durability too. It could withstand more damage and keep flying while the fragile Zero would fall apart under similar fire. As the battle began, the first signs of the Zero's vulnerability became apparent. The American pilots, trained in tactics that maximized the Hellcat's strengths, engaged the Zero pilots with ruthless efficiency. The Hellcats, flying in tightly coordinated formations, were able to pick off the Japanese planes one by one. Zero pilots, accustomed to outmaneuvering their opponents, found themselves outgunned and outclassed. Every time they made a move to evade, the Hellcat was already there waiting. One by one, the Zeros were brought down. A skilled Japanese pilot might have once been able to outfly an enemy, using sharp turns and evasive maneuvers to gain an advantage. But against a squadron of Hellcats, this was no longer enough. The Zero's agility couldn't overcome the Hellcat's superior firepower, its ability to sustain hits, and the myth of the invincible Zero was being crushed in real time as one after another Japanese planes exploded in the sky. For the Japanese pilots, the suddenness of their downfall was unimaginable. They had entered the battle with the same belief that had carried them through countless other engagements: the Zero would give them the upper hand. But what they didn't anticipate was how quickly their aircraft and their own skill would be overwhelmed by the relentless precision and firepower of the Americans. The experience was jarring. For many of them, it was the first time they had faced an enemy who, in the heat of battle, the Zero pilots, though brave and experienced, could no longer deny the reality. They had been trained to fight in a world where their plane could outmatch anything it encountered. Now faced with the Hellcat, the Avenger, and the relentless firepower of the American forces, they realized their plane, once the terror of the skies, was a liability. The Zero, which had been the heart of Japan's air combat doctrine, could no longer stand against the overwhelming force of American industrial power and tactical expertise. Meanwhile, the American pilots, their training paying off, showed no signs of slowing down. The battle for them was not about heroism. It was about duty, about the execution of strategy that had been carefully developed. They had no time to celebrate the downing of each plane. Every Zero that fell was another step toward breaking Japan's ability to fight in the air, and they knew that every minute brought them closer to winning the war. The battle for them was methodical routine even. There was no emotional reaction, only the next order to follow and the next enemy to face. As the day wore on, the Japanese forces were pushed further back, their planes steadily falling from the sky. The First Air Fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa, had committed all its remaining air power. But by the end of the day, the battle had been decisively won by the Americans, and the Japanese had lost not just a strategic victory, but their last hope of holding air superiority in the Pacific. The myth of the Zero had crumbled, and with it, the foundation of Japan's air strategy. The battle marked the end of an era for the Japanese forces. The A-6M0, once a legendary aircraft, was no longer the centerpiece of their air fleet. What had once been the symbol of their aerial prowess was now reduced to a target in the skies, easily overwhelmed by the relentless and superior tactics of the United States. The collapse of this myth didn't just signify the destruction of a plane, it symbolized the turning of the tide in the Pacific War. For Japan, the battle had shown that their aircraft, their pilots, and their strategies were no longer sufficient to stand up to the technological and tactical advancements of their enemies. The myth of invincibility had been shattered. The 19th of June, 1944, marked the moment when the myth of Japan's invincible air power shattered. The battle over the Philippine Sea didn't just change the immediate dynamics of the war, it laid the groundwork for the final collapse of Japan's ability to maintain a prolonged conflict. For the Japanese, the aftermath was a crushing blow. Their once proud air force, embodied by the legendary A-6M0, had been decimated. The battle was not just a defeat in terms of aircraft lost, it was the destruction of their fighting spirit. Their fleet of Zero fighters, once considered unmatched in agility and combat capability, had been overwhelmed by American superiority in tactics and technology. The Hellcats and Avengers had proven themselves to be the better weapons in the hands of well-coordinated, trained American pilots. This was not just about lost planes. It was a strategic and psychological defeat for Japan. The Japanese High Command had believed in the superiority of their aircraft and pilots, but now they could no longer rely on them to hold back the American assault. Japan's ability to defend its skies was gone, and with it, their hopes of stalling the American advance. Their failure to adapt quickly to the changing nature of aerial warfare had left them vulnerable, and the collapse of the Zero myth represented the beginning of the end for their war effort. The immediate consequence for Japan was the loss of air superiority, which had been the backbone of their naval and military strategy. Without the ability to control the skies, Japan's naval forces became exposed, and their ability to protect their island empire was severely compromised. The American pilots, who had already gained a strategic edge with their superior training and equipment, now had free rein to strike Japan's remaining defenses. With their air force shattered, Japan was forced into a defensive posture they were not prepared for. They could no longer launch effective counterattacks. For the United States, the victory was more than just a tactical one. It was the final confirmation that their industrial and strategic advantages were now overwhelming. The U.S. had proven that superior numbers, better technology, and more effective tactics could crush the Japanese air forces. In the aftermath of the battle, American confidence soared. They had shattered the Japanese myth of invincibility and replaced it with a new reality that the United States could not only challenge Japan's air power. The battle also proved that America's logistical and industrial strength was unmatched. The rapid replacement of lost aircraft, the efficiency in pilot training, and the ability to continuously pump out new planes and ships meant that the U.S. could sustain its combat effectiveness far longer than Japan. While Japan was slowly running out of resources and experienced pilots, the U.S. could afford to take losses and still maintain a constant pressure on the Japanese forces. This imbalance in resources would continue to favor the U.S. for the rest of the war. As the war progressed, the collapse of Japan's air forces began to have profound effects on the Pacific theater. The destruction of their air superiority, coupled with the U.S. Navy's continued dominance, meant that Japan's defensive perimeter continued to shrink. Each battle after the Philippine Sea pushed Japan's forces further back, eroding their ability to mount a successful defense. On the home front, the loss of air superiority had a lasting psychological impact on both the Japanese military and civilian morale. For the U.S., the victory represented a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. It validated their strategy of industrial production, superior technology, and effective coordination. The U.S. had proven that they could outproduce and outfight the Japanese at every turn. The victory at the Philippine Sea marked a clear turning point. The Americans were no longer reacting to Japanese aggression, but were now firmly in control of the Pacific. The momentum had shifted irreversibly in their favor. The consequences of the Philippine Sea battle would echo throughout the rest of the war. It hastened the decline of Japan's fighting capability and paved the way for the Allied victory. The battle was a clear sign that